So before I dive in, I just want to make it clear that this presentation is based on a series of articles that I did for HeavyBit about a year ago. And it's specifically targeting developer-facing startups. So some of the questions I propose that you all ask yourselves may seem a little more suited to a small company or a startup just starting to build out their developer community. But I still think there's value in revisiting some of these early stage questions for your community and your company because they're honestly always valid. And also, this is such a broad and important issue that has many, many different approaches. I'll only be surfacing like some of the important questions that you can ask yourself, but this work is comprehensive and ongoing. I certainly don't have all the answers, but I'm hopeful this will have you starting to explore some of the ways that you can make your developer communities more inclusive. And so I would just ask in this presentation that y'all kind of like let me walk through the content before jumping in with any questions. Only because when I've presented some of this content in the past, I've noticed folks would ask questions that would then be part of some of the content that I would answer later in the presentation. So I think what we can do is take these questions and make them discussion topics for once I've wrapped up the actual presentation portion. Yeah, okay. So quick introduction of me. I have been working in tech for almost 17 years now. And when I came to update these slides, I was a little like freaked out by that fact. But my first job building community for an actual API and developer product was back in 2011, which also freaked me out. But I've been very lucky and privileged to work and learn from some amazing teams at companies like Mashery, which wound up being acquired by Intel. So I was there for a while. Keen.io, Shopify, and last year I took the plunge to launch my own developer community consultancy called Listen Community Consulting. I learned very quickly that running your own business is extremely hard, and so props to all the entrepreneurs out there. So, you know, as a, you know, a learning from that, I started to put out feelers, and ultimately it turned into an opportunity to wind up relocating to Boston and taking the lead on HubSpot's growing developer community. So that's where I am now. So I want to just talk about the questions that we're going to cover. I'll be proposing some questions for kind of both founders and community builders to ask themselves when building out a developer community. So I won't read through all of these, but just take a quick look to get a sense of what we'll be covering. You'll also notice that I use many cute animal pictures to keep you all engaged. So I hope that is an effective strategy. So before I dive into some of these key questions, I just want to take some time to make sure that we're kind of working with the same definitions. You know, diversity, inclusion, and belonging are all really important and crucial terms that have kind of been part of our collective tech dialogue and conversation for a few years now. And it's kind of come to the point, in my opinion, that some of these words have been diluted and frankly overused. And without meaningful action, these are all kind of meaningless terms. So what I want to do is talk about how I view these terms to kind of contextualize some of the questions that I'll have you asking yourself. So these terms have been largely used in the terms I'm talking about, like inclusion, diversity, belonging. They've largely been used in the lens of tech, HR, recruitment, employee retention. So a lot of the focus of the work that I was doing at Listen as a consultancy, and I'm translating to some of that to the work I'm doing at HubSpot now, has been trying to kind of view the amazing work done by groups like Project Include and Paradigm, among many, many others. So these are all incredible like thinkers around diversity and inclusion, specifically typically around the employment and retention space. But I've been trying to take their work and kind of view it through the lens of developer community. And so the definitions I'm working with here are largely dictated by what I've learned from these organizations and these leaders. And so for the sake of this talk, inclusion is not just about making efforts to diversify your community, but really welcoming folks with open arms in a way that incorporates their specific and unique dimensions of diversity. Now, what am I talking about when I talk about dimensions of diversity? Just want to bring a little clarity into what that means. So I love this wheel of dimensions of diversity. It was created by some smart folks at Johns Hopkins University. And just taking a look, you can quickly see that these dimensions are what impact our experiences when kind of moving through the world. Some of these vectors of dimensions yield more or less privilege, and we all have our own unique constellation. Unfortunately, some folks' vectors leave them in kind of a net negative position of privilege, and the weight of some of these vectors also need to be considered. Ultimately, in my opinion, an inclusive community welcomes any of these sort of like individual constellations, but does take special care to ensure the kind of safety and belonging of folks with especially challenging constellations. So, with all that being said, the first question to ask yourself is, do you want to build an inclusive community? Because if you do, you'll need to put a lot of intentional and focused work on it. Some of the upcoming questions will kind of showcase exactly how. And if you aren't willing to put in the work and put it in early, your community will eventually kind of showcase that lack of effort. By not carving out intentional safe spaces for more marginalized community members, really narrowing the potential of your community and products growth. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. Okay, so now that I'm gonna assume that you're all ready to commit to building an inclusive community. And if you're not, feel free to take a break, go play some Animal Crossing or something like that. Who are you actually building your community for? Do you think you know? In the very early days of building out your developer community, just be sure to that you aren't just building spaces that you would enjoy participating in. Challenge your own assumptions. And we'll dig into this a bit more in some coming questions. Now, so challenging your assumptions can include asking folks beyond your own network. Chances are your network comprises largely of folks who kind of look like you and think like you. Personally, one of my favorite places to build broader developer connections and start some conversations is through the content-driven community Dev2. Very intentionally building a community that is both diverse and welcoming. My 2 cents is that I would avoid, trying to get conversations going in places like Hacker News and Stack Overflow, both kind of notoriously challenging spaces for marginalized folks. And next slide. So this question is an interesting one. This sometimes gets overlooked in the early days of building out a company, but your company founders actually make a tremendous impact and statement on the perception of inclusivity in your developer community. Now, statistically speaking, your developer product was likely founded by a white man or a group of white men. And that's, the reality of the sort of, demographics that we're dealing with in tech today. When this is the case, it's certainly not a foregone conclusion that you're not going to be able to showcase inclusion and diversity, but it's especially important to put an intentional and clear diversity and inclusion statement into place and showcase it wherever you can, sharing it broadly, making it a true commitment for a company from day one. All right, so now you've asked some broader groups about your community spaces, you've gotten some initial feedback, you're looking to leverage that early stage, more diverse network and actually start to get product feedback, which can really help, influence the makeup of your community as well. So one of my favorite stories that really showcases what happens when there's a missed opportunity to gather more inclusive product feedback. I attended a tech inclusion conference in San Francisco. I feel like this was probably longer ago than I realized, but maybe 2017, something like that. So at that, I saw a talk by someone named Nancy Douillon. She was at the time, a UX researcher and project manager at Google. Her talk was all about inclusive product design, and she showcased a really glaring example of unconscious bias oversight and a lack of diverse feedback. When the team that released the Oculus VR headset in the early days was essentially unwearable. The actual headset was unwearable by folks with thicker hairstyles, so dreadlocks or anything like that, folks wearing turbans, or any sort of other modalities outside of that of the largely white male product team and beta community that was testing it. So they obviously course corrected, and I believe the headset is a little bit more inclusive of all different types of hairstyles now, but it's a hardware example, but it does showcase how easily glaring feedback omissions can impact a product's user experience. And then another really nice and simple example that I love, I went to a conference in Seattle a few years ago called DevRel Summit, and Tomomi Umura, who at the time was a developer advocate at Slack, was just showcasing how Slack's docs don't actually assume that a developer knows what concepts like OAuth are, and they clearly define them before going into details around flow and access. So, simple details like this may be overlooked by a community of experienced developers, but that closes off access to a new developer that may write the next great integration, sorry. And that's like another sort of subtle dimension that I think of inclusivity that we need to pay extra special attention to in developer community building, and that's the dimension of technical skill. The assumption that folks are at a certain level or not is something that needs to kind of inform our documentation especially. So chances are you are creating and publishing content regularly for your audience, all of you in this room probably. Perhaps your engineers are contributing blog content, and you may even have developer advocates on board creating content, sample code, all that good stuff. Your community is adding value to both your company's developer community and the developer community at large. But similar to the product design oversights that we talked about around Oculus, like some unchecked content can actually unknowingly alienate members of your developer community. One such example is I've seen an incredibly large number of hard to grok readmes, like readmes that are just super unintuitive and make a lot of assumptions. So I think that's actually I wanted to call that specifically as one type of developer community content that can be often overlooked. And so how can you go around mitigating this? There's a bunch of tools out there that can help you with your content. Some of the tools that I like to kind of recommend folks start with is there's something called the Gender Decoder. That is an open source tool that allows folks to just input content and get back flags of like which keywords may be a little alienating to various genders or gender identities. And one thing that I wanted to call out is that when I first did this talk, I used to reference Textio. And unfortunately, Textio's free tool is no longer, and now you have to pay something like $70,000, or maybe it's much lower than that, but some unreasonable amount to be able to access their tools, which is just too bad because it was something that was very helpful from a community perspective. And I will also give a shout out to our team at HubSpot who've put together a really fantastic inclusive language guide. If you go to lsn2.us/inclusion, you can get all of the tools and references that I'm going to talk about today. I still need to add the HubSpot guide, but I will be adding it today. All right. So as much as you need to ensure that your written content is inclusive, visual cues around your content and community are equally important to get right. But choosing inclusive imagery is not necessarily as simple as writing your content through a keyword engine. Visual choices you make may actually need to be truly representative of your community. So for example, there are a lot of fantastic image sets out there. You can use them for job listings, but if you don't actually have any folks of color working in your startup, you're setting a potential applicant up for disappointment and deception and a potential community member. So if you're considering images to go alongside more generic content, maybe a feature update, open source project page, event invites, whatever it may be, these images can send a signal that representation of all developers is important to your company, but just make sure that you're using these images contextually in kind of the right places. Let's see, I skipped a slide. Just some shout outs to some great collections that are available out there. The Women of Color in Tech Flickr set has been around for a long time. I think I'm starting to see it pop up just about everywhere. I mean, so we don't want to overuse these images, but at the same time, it's a fantastic set that's out there, open Creative Commons license, but encouraged to use with attribution. I don't see a lot of folks using attribution with it, so watch out for that. Also broadly released a gender spectrum collection last year that is fantastic, but also has some very specific usage guidelines. So definitely take a look at what those are. Those are all available on at Listen to US/inclusion. And here's what I feel like is, something, a much discussed topic that I potentially could have done an entire, much longer talk on just this topic itself, but codes of conduct. So if there's one community investment that you're going to make in your community's growth, it's ensuring that you have a comprehensive and enactable code of conduct. So even if you don't have an online user community or forum, or if you're at all like open source, or if you're even hosting events, virtual or non, probably just virtual right now, but A code of conduct is a way to ensure that developers of all walks of life feel protected and welcome in your community. A few resources that I like to kind of point folks to start from are the Geek Feminism Wiki. It's no longer being actively maintained, but does still contain a ton of really great evergreen resources. I will also say that just as important as getting your code of conduct actually created is ensuring that enforcement is also included in part of that process and training for enforcement. Getting the community team or developer advocates all trained up on how to respond to code of conduct violations is really the only way to ensure that having a code of conduct will provide meaningful value to your community. One resource that I do like, I know there's actually a bunch out there and we can talk about some of those maybe with some folks on the call afterwards, but Valerie Aurora and Mary Gardner wrote a fantastic code of conduct enforcement book that can be found on my resources page. And sorry, just want to make sure I'm on the right page here. Yeah, okay, so the last point is a big one. So this may feel like I'm making a bit of a departure from the last few kind of areas of suggestions, but feedback gathering is the really tried and true way to make sure that you're listening to your now ideally diverse community and taking their feedback and putting it into place. And that's what's going to ensure that folks feel heard and feel included. Especially when it comes to a developer community, which typically is very product feedback oriented and not necessarily as conversational. It's more product feedback solutions oriented. So taking that direct feedback from the community and pushing it into your product is really important. There's lots of different ways you can go about that. I think folks, we can talk about this after about your favorite channels, but I've seen a lot of communities living in Slack and Discord around developers. And both are great tools that are really easy to set up and give you that immediate kind of like feedback mechanism. But there's also some drawbacks that I just want folks to kind of think about, especially around Slack and maybe Discord as well. As you're kind of like seeing conversations and feedback stream through Slack and or Discord, there are really valuable nuggets of knowledge that can kind of vanish into thin air and be kind of hard to retrieve, especially if you don't have a paid instance of Slack for community members in your company. And as your community grows, it'll no longer be sustainable to provide immediate answers to questions as they come in on these channels. And if you're setting up that expectation, it can be a big challenge to maintain as you grow, which you hopefully will. And finally, there's typically some level of walled access. Net new developers with questions or product feedback may not yet be committed to your community enough to join yet another Slack or Discord. And I also say these companies have different use cases in mind. I think Discord is probably a little bit more community friendly, but Slack is really ultimately a workplace collaboration tool, and that's what their product roadmap kind of reflects. And so there's tremendous community benefits to Slack, but at the same time, the company is not moving in a community-friendly direction. If anyone wants to correct me on that, if anyone's here from Slack, then please do tell me. I would be overjoyed. But just some things to keep in mind. So I typically would recommend to clients to try to focus on forums. They can be a less immediately satisfying kind of immediately satisfying solution tool, but there's huge benefits from a community perspective, especially for integrating the feedback from all of your community members and making it welcoming to new folks. So from an SEO perspective, forums get indexed by search engines, so answers to any long tail questions or even new questions come up in search results. They're highly SERP friendly. And so solving any developer pain before your team even knows about it also takes a little bit of weight off your team, so you can focus on this really important stuff. You can also track traffic from different resources. I'm gonna skip over these parts. I did do, like I mentioned at the top of this, I did do a whole series on HeavyBit, which I will link to, that kind of fleshes out a few of the other things. Another fantastic talk that I'll give a shout out to is Bear Douglas did a talk at HeavyBit in 2017 all about incorporating developer feedback. And that is on the HeavyBit website. She was at Twitter at the time, but it's a fantastic talk. So I was going to recap some of her main points here, but instead I'll just tell you to go and watch it. Oh my God, it's 12:27. Okay, I'm almost done. um, so I went through a lot of this already. Some of this, open channels for feedback around like Slack and discourse and forums. All right, that's my thank you slide, but I wanted to just kind of, I feel like I'm skipping a flow here. My notes aren't corresponding. Wait, yeah, no, this is good. So I just want to give you all kind of a shout out to like, make sure that you're sort of asking yourself these key questions, especially if you want to build an innovative, and productive community. Like the more voices that are providing feedback to your developer tools and in your developer community, the better the outcome will be. And the more developers that are building interesting things on it, the more, depending on what your developer use case is, in HubSpot's case, we're a platform and a marketplace, the more different types of, developers that get exposed to our platform and our APIs, the more innovative and, sort of like cutting edge products that we're going to get. So not only do I feel like we have an obligation as community folks and developer community folks to build welcoming spaces, but there is all that ROI and annoying capitalist stuff that you can justify to the powers that be to make this worthwhile. So that is the end of my talk.